you think you're alone, safe in your own home, until you hear a sound that chills you to the bone. What happens next will leave you questioning how well you really know your neighbors. I had always felt like there was something off about my neighbor, who we'll call Mr. Johnson. He lived a few doors down when I was growing up. Mr. Johnson lived alone in the largest house on the street, and nobody really knew anything about him. He was always quiet and kept to himself, but there was something about the way he looked at me that made me feel uneasy. I would see him in passing almost every day, but we never talked. He was about 50 years old, if I had to guess. He had short gray hair and a mustache, and he walked with a limp, though I never knew why. It wasn't until I was home alone one day that I discovered the true extent of his creepiness. It was a typical summer day, and I was playing video games in my room. My room was at the back of the house. When I gamed, I liked to tune out the rest of the world, so I closed my curtains and turned off the lights. I also wore a good noise-canceling headset. Suddenly, I felt like somebody had come home. That was strange because my parents weren't supposed to be back until the following day. Like I said, I couldn't hear anything, but I could feel the vibrations of footsteps stomping around the house. I was pretty sure someone had broken in. I paused my game and removed my headset, then listened closely, but the sound had stopped. I shrugged it off and continued playing. After a few minutes, it started again. This time it was stronger and more persistent. I could feel each step rattle through my body. I got up to investigate. Tiptoeing out of my room, I cautiously walked down the stairs. I peeked carefully around each corner as I made my way to the kitchen, which was where it seemed like the noise was coming from. When I entered the kitchen, I saw that one of the cabinets was open. I was sure I had closed it before I started playing, but now it was wide open. I approached the cabinet, my heart racing with fear. As I reached for the handle, I heard a voice behind me, looking for something. I froze. My blood ran cold as I turned around to see Mr. Johnson standing there, a knife in his hand and a sinister smile on his face. "What are you doing here?" I managed to stammer. My voice cracked, and my hands trembled as I took a step back. "Just checking on you," he said, his tone casual but laced with something menacing. "I noticed your parents were gone. Thought you might need some company." I could barely think. My fight or flight instincts kicked in, but I felt paralyzed. He started moving closer, and I knew I had to act fast. "I'm going to call the police," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. "Oh, I wouldn't do that," he replied, his grin widening. "You wouldn't want to make me angry, would you?" My phone was in my pocket, but I didn't dare reach for it while he was watching me. Desperate, I took a deep breath and bolted past him, running as fast as I could to the front door. He lunged after me but missed, and I managed to get outside and scream for help. Thankfully, a neighbor across the street heard me and came running. Mr. Johnson hesitated, then turned and fled out the back door. The police arrived shortly after, and I told them everything. They searched his house and found disturbing evidence, pictures of me and other kids in the neighborhood, along with journals detailing his twisted thoughts. He was arrested and sentenced to prison. I never saw him again. To this day, I still have nightmares about Mr. Johnson and the way he used to look at me. I moved out of that house as soon as I was old enough, and my parents moved shortly after. It's hard to think that things wouldn't have escalated beyond creepy. I'm sure if he hadn't been stopped, someone would have gotten hurt. It was a really close call, and by far the creepiest thing I've ever experienced. Have you ever wondered if the quietest person in your neighborhood might be hiding something? When our new neighbor moved in, we thought she was just shy. But what began as odd behavior turned into something far more unsettling, a mystery that lingered long after we left. About 10 years ago, a new neighbor moved into the house across from us in my old neighborhood. She was a woman in her mid-40s who lived alone and rarely interacted with anyone. If someone greeted her, she would smile politely and respond, but it was clear she wasn't interested in forming friendships. She often stayed inside her house, and on the rare occasions she came outside, it was either to take short walks or retrieve her mail. At first glance, she seemed friendly enough, but there was something odd about her demeanor. I was a kid at the time, and like most kids, I spent my afternoons playing outside with friends. We'd run around in the yard, laughing and shouting while she sat on her patio and watched us for hours. She didn't even try to hide it. Sometimes we'd glance over and see her sitting there, staring at us with an unsettling, blank expression. If she wasn't on her patio, she'd peek through her curtains, her eyes following our every move. It felt as though she was always watching us, even when we were inside our home. One evening, my family and I were sitting in the den, enjoying a relaxing night watching TV. Suddenly, the lights in front of our house flickered on, and we noticed a shadow moving near the window. It looked like someone was outside, but we couldn't make out their face. My dad got up to investigate. By the time he reached the front door, the person had vanished. He scanned the area but found nothing unusual. We brushed it off, assuming it was probably nothing, and went to bed. The next morning, however, my dad discovered something strange. The solar panel lights we'd stuck into the ground next to our driveway were gone. The soil where they'd been was visibly disturbed. As he backed out of the driveway to head to work, he glanced over at our neighbor's yard. There, lined up neatly next to her driveway, were all 5 of our missing solar lights exactly as we had arranged them. Amused but bewildered, he called my mom and me outside to take a look. Sure enough, the lights were there. Our neighbor, acting as if nothing was out of the ordinary, was outside watering her flowers. She gave us an awkward smile and a wave, but we didn't confront her. They were just cheap lights, after all, and not worth causing a scene over. Still, the incident marked the beginning of a series of odd events. Every year, our holiday decorations, whether for Christmas or Halloween, would mysteriously disappear or get damaged. None of our other neighbors had this problem. One Halloween, our carefully carved pumpkins vanished the night before the holiday. Frustrated, we eventually stopped decorating altogether. It didn't stop there. Our neighbor began copying everything we did. If we planted a certain type of flower in our garden, she would do the same the next day. If my mom wore a sun hat while gardening, our neighbor would show up the following afternoon wearing an identical one. If my parents and I were outside raking leaves, she'd grab a rake and start raking her yard, even if there weren't any leaves to gather. Despite everything, we never confronted her. She didn't seem dangerous, just peculiar. Over the years, we grew accustomed to her strange behavior. When we eventually moved to a new neighborhood, we felt a sense of relief. Our new neighbors were kind and respectful, a refreshing change from the unnerving presence of the woman who had once been our neighbor. Looking back, I still wonder, was she just eccentric, or was there something darker beneath her odd behavior? What would you do if a neighbor's escalating aggression unveiled a horrifying secret that had been buried in plain sight for years? Stay with me as we unravel a tale of fear, mystery, and dark revelations lurking just beneath the surface. At 4 a.m., the tranquility of the night shattered. Screams, cries, and desperate pleas for help pierced the silence, jolting me awake. My heart pounded as I sat up, instinctively wanting to remain hidden beneath the safety of my blanket. From my window, I looked out onto the dimly lit street below. What I saw made my breath catch in my throat. Adam, a young man from the neighborhood, was yelling and shoving David, the frail elderly man who lived alone at the end of the street. David's voice, weak and cracked with desperation, cried out, "He hit me. That goddamn kid hit me." Adam glared at the onlookers who gathered in the shadows, daring them to intervene. "You deserved it, you old bastard. You've been terrorizing this neighborhood for years," he spat. David, known for his gruff demeanor and eerie solitude, was an enigma, a man everyone avoided. Yet now there he was, crumpled against the wall after Adam's relentless shove. The old man attempted to retaliate with feeble swings, but Adam's punches quickly overpowered him. David collapsed, his lifeless body unmoving, as the sound of approaching sirens cut through the tension. The police arrived, their flashing lights illuminating the gruesome scene. Both men were taken away, Adam, furious and defiant, and David, battered and unconscious. Whispers filled the neighborhood. What had caused this violent outburst? The narrative quickly shifted. Adam became the victim of a long-standing reign of fear, while David, once merely a recluse, was painted as a villain. But the most shocking discovery came days later when the police searched David's house, following the commotion. Beneath layers of dirt and debris in his backyard, they unearthed the skeleton, a chilling relic of an unimaginable crime. The whispers turned to screams of disbelief. Who was the victim buried in David's backyard? Why had he harbored such a dark secret? Speculation gripped our community. As the forensics team worked, the neighborhood's quiet turned oppressive, each revelation unraveling a new layer of fear and distrust. What we once dismissed as harmless oddities, David's muttering, his drawn curtains, his distant stares, suddenly took on sinister significance. The man we thought we knew was a stranger, his facade crumbling to reveal a monster in our midst. Questions lingered like ghosts. How long had the skeleton been there? Had David lived among us, hiding his heinous act in plain sight? Would we have ever known the truth if not for that fateful fight? David's grim secret left a scar on our community. The street I once walked with casual familiarity now seemed foreign and unnerving. The thought that such darkness could reside so close to home haunts me to this day. What if your neighbor's kindness wasn't just neighborly but a calculated game of manipulation and control? In this spine-chilling tale, the house next door hides secrets that blur the lines between friendly gestures and sinister intentions. Hold on to your seat, won't believe where this story takes you. When we first moved into Sunnybrook Estates, I thought we'd found our dream home. It was a charming little house with a wraparound porch, a lush front yard, and a quiet neighborhood filled with smiling faces. My wife Leela and I, newlyweds, were eager to build our lives together, and this place seemed like the perfect backdrop. Our next-door neighbor, Mrs. Eldridge, was the first to welcome us. She appeared at our door on moving day, holding a plate of chocolate chip cookies, warm and fragrant. Her gray hair was pinned neatly into a bun, and her blue eyes twinkled like sunlight reflecting off her perfectly polished garden stones. She seemed harmless, kind even in her floral apron and pearl necklace. "I just wanted to say hello to my new neighbors," she said, her voice as soft as a lullaby. "I'm Mrs. Eldridge. If you need anything at all, don't hesitate to ask." Her cookies were delicious. She invited us over for tea the next day, and Leela, always eager to make friends, happily accepted. I tagged along, curious about our new neighbor. Her home was impeccable, not a speck of dust in sight. The floral wallpaper looked as though it had been hung the day before, and the air smelled faintly of lavender and lemon. Her garden, visible through the kitchen window, was a riot of color roses, tulips, and lilies blooming simultaneously, defying the seasons. "You have a lovely home," I said. Mrs. Eldridge smiled, her eyes lingering on me for a moment too long. "Thank you, Max. I try my best to keep it welcoming." It wasn't until later that I realized I hadn't introduced myself. Over the next few weeks, Mrs. Eldridge became a fixture in our lives. She brought over pies, offered gardening tips, and somehow always appeared at just the right moment, whether we were unloading groceries, arguing over a broken shelf, or sitting on the porch in silence. "She's just lonely," Leela said when I voiced my unease. "She's old, Max. She probably doesn't have anyone else." But things began to feel off. One night I woke up to a strange sound, muffled crying, faint but persistent. I nudged Leela awake, and we both listened. It seemed to be coming from Mrs. Eldridge's house. The next morning I asked her about it. "Oh, I was watching an old movie," she said with a laugh. "I didn't mean to disturb you." But there was something in her smile that didn't reach her eyes. The strange noises became more frequent whispers, crying, and once, a low growl that made my skin crawl. I tried to brush it off, but the unease grew. Mrs. Eldridge's uncanny knowledge of our lives didn't help. She mentioned my fear of drowning, a secret I hadn't even told Leela. She complimented a song Leela had been humming the night before in the shower when our windows were closed and the bathroom was far from hers. Maybe she's just intuitive. Leela suggested, though her tone was less certain. One rainy afternoon, while cleaning out the attic, we found the diary. It was old, the leather cover cracked and faded, the pages yellowed with age. The name on the first page was Sarah Nolan, our home's previous tenant. The entries started innocuously enough. "Mrs. Eldridge is so sweet. She brought me muffins today. I feel so lucky to have such a kind neighbor." But as I read further, the tone shifted. "She knows too much about me. I never told her about my dad, but she mentioned his death today so casually. It felt wrong." The final entry was chilling. "She's watching me. I hear her at night, whispering through the walls. I think she's inside my head. I'm scared. If you're reading this, get out. Don't let her know you found this." Leela and I stared at each other, the air thick with dread. That night, the noises grew louder. The whispers seemed to seep through the walls, filling every corner of the house. Shadows flickered where there shouldn't have been any, and the temperature dropped sharply. Leela clutched my arm, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "We have to leave," she whispered. But when I opened the front door, Mrs. Eldridge was standing on our porch, smiling up at me. "Is everything all right?" I tried to answer, but my words stuck in my throat. Her eyes gleamed unnaturally in the dim light, and for the first time I noticed how still she was. Too still, not a twitch, not a blink. She stepped inside before I could stop her. "I think you've been reading things you shouldn't," she said, her voice soft but menacing. Over the following days, things spiraled. Leela and I fought constantly, our once happy home now suffocating with tension. I began to doubt my own thoughts, my memories. Mrs. Eldridge was everywhere, always watching, always smiling. Desperate, Leela found an old book on banishing malevolent spirits. It spoke of entities that fed on fear, twisting their victims' lives until they were consumed entirely. The ritual required fire, salt, and blood specifically, a sacrifice. The night we performed the ritual was the longest of my life. Leela drew the symbols while I gathered the materials. Mrs. Eldridge appeared as we began, her pleasant facade melting away to reveal a grotesque form. Her skin was mottled and stretched, her mouth filled with needle-like teeth. She laughed, a sound that chilled me to my core. "You think you can get rid of me?" she hissed. "I've been here longer than you can imagine." Leela chanted the incantation, her voice trembling. The house shook, and Mrs. Eldridge screamed, her body writhing as the symbols began to glow. In the end, the ritual worked, but not without cost. Leela collapsed, her face pale and lifeless. Mrs. Eldridge was gone, but so was my wife. Now I sit alone in this house, surrounded by silence. The garden is overgrown, the walls are cracked, and I can still feel Mrs. Eldridge's presence. Some nights I hear her laughter in the distance. I know she's not truly gone, and I know she's waiting for me. What would you do if the nightmare you never thought could happen became your reality? A neighbor's sinister obsession turns an ordinary street into a haunting mystery. Stay with me as we uncover the chilling truth behind a horrific encounter that will make you think twice about where you live. My neighbor was always an odd figure, the kind of person you notice because of how deliberately they try not to be noticed. We called him Grumps, a name my kids came up with, though it suited him perfectly. His disheveled appearance and constant muttering set him apart, but it wasn't until his wife passed away that his behavior took a dark turn. At first, it was just small things. He stopped speaking to anyone and would sit for hours in a rotting wooden chair on his front porch, staring out with a blank, unsettling gaze. He seemed harmless, albeit creepy, until he started photographing anyone who came near his property. The click of his old camera, a bulky model from the 1990s, became a regular, unnerving sound on our street. I quickly established rules for my children: no playing in the front yard, no lingering near Grump's house, and no speaking to him under any circumstances. It felt drastic, but the way he lingered on the edge of his porch, watching, made my skin crawl. Even my husband, who usually dismissed my worries, started avoiding the front yard, leaving it to me to monitor from inside the house. Everything changed the day my daughters had their friends over. 4 girls, aged 8 to 10, were running around in the backyard, laughing and playing. I was watching them from the kitchen window when I saw Grumps shuffle out of his house. My stomach dropped. He never left his property unless he had to, and he always moved slowly, his cane barely supporting his frail frame. But this time, he seemed energized, his eyes gleaming with a disturbing intent as he made his way down the sidewalk toward my house. My fight-or-flight instincts kicked in. I sprinted outside, grabbed the girls, and herded them into the house, locking the doors behind me. Grumps stopped at the edge of my yard, his bony hand resting on his cane. And then he did it. He reached down, fumbling awkwardly at his pants. I won't go into detail, but the sight made me gag, and I immediately called the police. My hands shook as I explained the situation, emphasizing that this man was a danger not just to my kids, but to the entire neighborhood. When the officers finally arrived nearly 3 hours later, Grumps had retreated back to his porch, his face blank and unbothered. The police questioned him briefly, but since he hadn't technically stepped onto my property, they said there was little they could do. He's not breaking any laws, they told me dismissively. I was furious and helpless. The next few weeks were quiet. Grumps didn't leave his house again, but the unease lingered. I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was brewing. My husband, frustrated by the lack of action from the police, started talking about confronting Grumps himself. I begged him not to. The man might have been frail, but there was a darkness in his eyes that made my blood run cold. Then it happened. One evening, as the sun set and the shadows stretched long across the street, Grumps emerged again. This time he didn't stop at the edge of his yard. He crossed the sidewalk, his cane tapping ominously against the pavement, and stepped onto our property. I screamed for my husband, who bolted out of the house just as Grumps reached our porch. The confrontation was explosive. My husband demanded to know what he wanted, why he was here. Grumps didn't respond. Instead, he pulled something from his pocket, a photograph. He handed it to my husband, who turned pale as he stared at the image. It was a picture of my daughters, taken through their bedroom window. My husband's fury erupted. He grabbed Grumps by the collar, shaking him as he shouted for an explanation. Grumps just smiled, a chilling, toothless grin, and muttered something incomprehensible. My husband let him go, shoving him back toward the street, and ordered him never to come near our house again. We called the police again, and this time they took things more seriously. They searched Grumps' house and found dozens of similar photographs, all taken without anyone's knowledge. They also found notebooks filled with disturbing writings, ramblings about purity and protecting innocence. Grumps was arrested, but the damage had been done. Our sense of safety was shattered. The neighborhood never felt the same after that. People whispered about what might have happened if we hadn't caught him when we did. I couldn't stop thinking about the photographs. How long had he been watching us? Watching my children? We installed cameras and extra locks, but it wasn't enough to erase the memory of his hollow grin or the cold, detached way he'd handed over that photograph. Even now, years later, I still feel a chill whenever I see someone sitting on a porch, staring silently at the world around them. Grumps taught me a horrifying truth sometimes: the monsters don't hide. Sometimes they live right in front of us, watching, waiting, and smiling. What if the harmless old man next door turned out to be someone far darker than anyone could have imagined? This is the haunting story of an elderly neighbor whose behavior took a disturbing turn, leaving a family in fear and a community forever changed. It's been 173 days since this whole Sally debacle started, minus 173 days of my wife, Alicia, turning into a total psycho, all because I dared to be nice to our new neighbor. It all started innocently enough. Sally moved in next door, a bubbly blonde with a laugh that could melt glaciers. She had an adorable little Shih Tzu, all fluffy and white, and they were always out in the yard together. I caught myself smiling at her, just being neighborly. One afternoon I was out watering Goldfin, our Labrador puppy, when Sally came over, all smiles. She asked about the best place to buy fertilizer, and I, being the helpful, sort of single again dude that I am, told her about this awesome place downtown. That's when things started to turn sour. Alicia, who had been inside, came out, her face like thunder. She gave me the stink eye, didn't even acknowledge Sally, and then marched back inside. That was the start. Over the next few weeks, Alicia started acting really weird, cold shoulders, silent treatments, and passive-aggressive comments about how much I loved helping our new neighbor. It was like she was obsessed with this imaginary scenario of me running off with Sally, which couldn't be further from the truth. One day, Alicia started complaining about the yard needing work. Now, I'm not exactly a green thumb, but I'm not useless either. I helped her plant some new flowers, trim some bushes, just doing what any normal husband would do. But Alicia wouldn't stop complaining. Sally's yard looks so much nicer. She'd whine, practically throwing a tantrum. It's so unfair. Why can't you do the same for me? I mean, come on, it's just a yard, right? Why did it have to be a competition? That's when I realized this was getting serious. Alicia was turning into a jealous green monster, and it was driving me crazy. I tried talking to her, telling her it was all in her head, that I wasn't romantically interested in Sally. But she wouldn't listen. She'd just get defensive and accuse me of lying. Then came the day I wish I could forget. Sally was moving some heavy furniture into her garage and she asked for help. "You want to be a good neighbor, right?" she said with a playful wink. "Of course, I'd be happy to help," I replied, thinking nothing of it. I was just being a decent human being, helping someone out. Alicia, who had been lurking around like a shadow, saw the whole thing. She went ballistic. "You're helping her move furniture? You're helping her move furniture while I'm stuck inside cleaning this mess," she exclaimed, her voice rising to a fever pitch. "You don't even care about me." I tried to reason with her. "Alicia, calm down. It's just some furniture," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "You're making a big deal out of nothing." "Nothing? You think this is nothing?" she screamed, tears streaming down her face. "Don't you see? You're in love with her, and you're just pretending to be nice to me." At this point, I was starting to get really annoyed. This whole situation was getting ridiculous. "Alicia, I'm not in love with Sally. This is insane," I shouted back, anger bubbling up inside me. "You're acting like a crazy person. Stop it." Alicia didn't stop. She stormed inside, her face contorted with rage. I went back to helping Sally, feeling totally frustrated and baffled. I finished helping Sally with her furniture, feeling a little awkward, but she just shrugged it off. She was cool about the whole thing. I told her about Alicia's behavior, and she shook her head and said, "Wow, that's crazy. Maybe you should just talk to her about it." I was about to go back inside when I saw Alicia come out of the house, a kettle in her hand. It looked like it was filled with boiling water. Before I could react, she walked towards Sally, her eyes filled with fury. She threw the boiling water on Sally's face. Sally screamed in pain, her face red and blistering. I ran toward her, my heart racing. "Alicia, what the hell are you doing?" I yelled, grabbing her arm. Alicia shoved me away, her eyes blazing with rage. She turned to Sally, who was now sobbing, and said, "You're going to get what you deserve. You stole my husband, and now I'm going to make you pay." At that moment, everything went black. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. My wife, the woman I loved, had just attacked my innocent neighbor. The neighbors called the police, and Alicia was arrested. The paramedics took Sally to the hospital, her face severely burned. It was a disaster. The cops took Alicia away, and I stood there, watching in disbelief. I couldn't comprehend what had just happened. My wife, the woman I loved, was now in prison for 5 months because of her insane jealousy. It's been 173 days since that day, and I still can't believe it. I've tried to reason with Alicia to get her to see what she did, but she refuses to take responsibility. She still believes I was secretly in love with Sally and that she was just protecting our marriage. I'm so annoyed and frustrated. My wife threw boiling water on someone because she was jealous of me being nice to a new neighbor. It's ridiculous. I never cheated on her, never even thought about it. I was just being a good neighbor, and now I'm stuck dealing with the consequences of her crazy actions. I miss the old Alicia, the one who was kind and supportive, not this paranoid, jealous monster. I don't know if I can ever forgive her for what she did. I don't know if our marriage can survive this. All I know is, I'm tired of being caught in the crossfire of this whole mess. I just want things to go back to normal. I want my wife back, the one I fell in love with, but I'm not sure if that's possible anymore. What started as a petty argument between neighbors over a dog turned into a terrifying encounter that nearly cost me my life. You never truly know what your neighbors are capable of until it's too late. Has your neighbor ever tried to kill you? Mine did. And why? Because my dog defecated in his yard. Once. Yes, just once. This guy had been nothing but trouble since the day I moved in. He strutted around shirtless during the summer, flexing and looking around to see if anyone was watching. You'd think someone trying so hard to appear macho would actually act like a man's man, but that wasn't the case. Anything requiring real physical labor except lifting weights was done by his wife. She was maybe 110 pounds soaking wet, but she mowed the lawn, fixed things around the house, and even did maintenance on their ridiculous jacked-up truck with its obnoxiously loud exhaust. She had to use a stepladder just to get into the thing. At first I thought he might have bad allergies or some other reason for avoiding yard work, but no, it was just who he was. Once I realized he was all bark and no bite, any fear I had of him quickly faded. We never made small talk, but he wasn't on my radar until one quiet Sunday morning. I stepped outside to grab the paper, and my wife's little furry rat of a dog, who I'll admit is actually pretty cool, followed me out. Usually he behaves, but that morning he pranced off to the grassy area alongside the driveway to relieve himself. I didn't think much of it at the time. Occasionally he does his business there, and when I notice I grab a bag and pick it up. I don't even like dog feces in my yard, so I get it. After finding my paper, I headed back into the house, but out of the corner of my eye, I noticed the dog in the familiar stance. Figuring I'd have to clean it up, I grabbed a bag and went back out. From the time the dog did his thing to the time I returned with the bag, maybe 30 seconds had passed. Before I could reach the door, loud banging erupted. My neighbor was at it, pounding on my door and yelling. This wasn't a polite knock, it was an angry, aggressive racket at 7:30 in the morning. Everyone else in the house was still asleep, so the noise instantly set me off. Already annoyed, I opened the door to find him ranting about how my dog had just taken a huge one in his yard. I automatically told him to lower his voice, but he kept yelling, ignoring everything I said. I tried to explain what I was doing and even showed him the bag in my hand, but he continued his tirade. I pushed past him and went to pick up the mess. But when I found the pile, I saw that it was actually well within my own property line. That was the final straw. I was already angry, but now I was furious. I tossed the bag into a nearby trash can and turned to head back inside. The entire time, I swallowed my frustration and kept my cool, trying to avoid escalating the situation. But then, he crossed a line. He threatened to hurt the dog if it ever came into his yard again. That was something I couldn't let slide. While I might joke about the dog, my wife loves that little guy like he's her child, and I love my wife. Even if it was just a threat, I knew it would devastate her if she heard it. I got in his face and started yelling back, matching his energy. He made things worse by poking me in the chest with his finger. Reflexively, I pushed him away. He fell backward, landing on his rear with a stunned look on his face. Finally, he was silent. He seemed to get the point, so I turned and went back inside, thinking the confrontation was over. but it wasn't. Less than 2 minutes later, the banging resumed, this time even louder. By now, my wife was awake and asking what was going on. The dog, of course, was barking his head off, adding to the chaos. I stormed to the door, ready to end this nonsense once and for all. But when I yanked it open, I was met with something I never expected. He was standing there with a gun. Before I could react, he fired a shot. The bullet whizzed past my head, so close I could feel the air move. It struck the wall behind me, narrowly missing my wife. How he missed at such close range I'll never know, but I'm incredibly thankful he did. I slammed the door shut and braced for more shots, but none came. My wife had already called the cops, and I stood by, shaking with adrenaline as we waited for them to arrive. When the police showed up, we told them everything. They found the bullet lodged in the wall, and several neighbors confirmed they had heard gunfire. With the evidence stacked against him, they cuffed him and hauled him away. Later that day, his wife came over to apologize. She explained they were planning to move soon, not because of the incident, but because they couldn't afford the house anymore. She said they'd need all the money they could get to hire a lawyer after what had just happened. Less than a week later, they were gone. It wasn't long before a new family moved in. They've been fantastic neighbors, polite, quiet, and friendly. But even though everything worked out in the end, I'm still not sure it was worth almost getting killed. What would you do if the seemingly perfect neighborhood you moved into turned out to hide a chilling secret one that put your family in danger? This is a story of trust, terror, and the lengths a parent will go to protect their child. I was living in a major city with my wife and son, working a corporate job at a bank. Ever since my son was born, I dreamed of moving somewhere quieter, but it was hard to leave my job. Every year I applied for a transfer, but nothing ever came up until my son turned 11. When it finally happened, it happened fast. From the moment we got the news, we had only 2 months to relocate. My son, Michael, was upset at first, as most kids would be, but he eventually came around. The transfer included a promotion and a nice raise, so money wasn't an issue for the move. We left our apartment and moved into a charming house in the suburbs. It was a single-story ranch-style home with a 2-car garage, 3 bedrooms, and a large basement that we decided would be Michael's playroom. The neighborhood was quiet and seemed perfect, a community mostly filled with older, retired residents. Our move took place during Michael's summer vacation, giving him time to adjust before starting school. A few days after settling in, we noticed a boy around Michael's age playing basketball alone in his driveway. Michael spotted him from the car, and it seemed obvious that they could become friends. Later that week, I introduced myself to the boy's family. They were very friendly and even invited me inside to chat. When I mentioned that our sons should meet, they seemed thrilled. Their son, Tyler, was a little shy at first, but it wasn't unusual for a kid meeting an adult for the first time. We set up a play date for the boys, and things seemed to go well at first. Michael, who was outgoing and social, quickly formed a bond with Tyler, even though Tyler was more reserved. The two spent their days riding bikes and playing Nintendo in our basement. It made me happy to see Michael adapting so well to the new environment. But after a few weeks, Michael became distant and no longer wanted to hang out with Tyler. When I asked why, he simply said he wasn't interested and didn't want to discuss it further. Respecting his choice, I didn't press him for details. Tyler, however, kept showing up at our house, though Michael would usually find an excuse to avoid him. Things seemed normal until one day, I came home to find graffiti on the side of our house. It wasn't anything major, but it felt out of place in our quiet neighborhood. Then, a few days later, I noticed scratches near the back door lock, as if someone had tried to break in. I installed a security camera as a precaution. A few nights later, the footage showed a boy sneaking around our yard. He was hard to identify, but he appeared to be about Michael's age. I suspected Tyler, but his parents insisted it wasn't him. Without concrete proof, there wasn't much I could do. The situation took a darker turn when Michael finally confided in us. He revealed why he'd ended his friendship with Tyler. While playing in the woods, Tyler had shown him a dead raccoon and started using it as a puppet with his bare hands. Another time, Tyler brought a kitchen knife to our house and held it to Michael's neck, saying he wanted to know what it would feel like. Tyler threatened to kill him if he told anyone. Just days after learning this, I came home to find the back door ajar. My heart sank as I rushed inside. In the living room, Tyler was holding one of our kitchen knives, standing just feet away from Michael. Though Michael was unharmed, he looked terrified. I demanded Tyler drop the knife. He hesitated, then put it down, laughing nervously as if it were all a joke. I immediately called the police. Tyler's parents finally took the situation seriously, but by then the damage was done. The incident left us shaken. Despite Tyler's parents' assurances, we couldn't stay. 6 months later, we moved again this time, to a place where Michael could feel safe. Looking back, I still can't fully comprehend how quickly things escalated. But one thing is certain: no job promotion or dream house is worth risking your child's safety